We interact with a lot of people with disabilities. We're missionaries into the disability culture that exists in America. And mainly we are invested in the people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. So typically that crowd that we serve live in group homes. Some of those live in their own apartments, usually sheltered and have some kind of help that comes in. A number of different people like that we serve. But the one thing that they do have in common, in general, they don't experience community, maybe like you guys experience community here at this church. It's something we often take for granted, is to have a loving, faith-based community that's around us, that helps us, that creates opportunities for us to grow in our relationship with God. And I don't know about you, but I depend on a lot of other people in my life that kind of walk with me arm in arm as we move together towards God. And so I don't take for granted how important that is. A few statistics. I don't really like statistics or numbers because I can't say the word statistics really well. But there are over 60 million people with disabilities in the United States, and less than 13% would call themselves Christians. So we're talking about a group of people. The largest unchurched people group in America are people with disabilities, over 50 million people who do not know Jesus as their Savior. And there's a small handful of ministries that exist that go out there to reach out to this group of people. And not that any church would ever say they wouldn't want people with disabilities in their midst, but there's a lot of barriers for people to get into church settings. Just a ride. Who was I talking to? Dennis, are you in here? Where's Dennis? Raise your hand. Dennis has been to camp, and he was talking about not being able, he's way in the back. He was out there loafing off, eating something. He'll come in if I talk about him. But he was telling me how he couldn't get a ride to camp this year. And that's one of the big barriers we find with the people we serve. Just a simple ride to get to church is an impossibility for a lot of people. The bus lines don't necessarily run all day on Sunday, and not everybody can ride the bus. So just not having a ride can become a barrier to being in a church setting. And there's a variety of other things which I'm not going to go into, but we attempt to kind of get around that fault in the system where people with disabilities don't get into our churches. So less than 5% of churches have any outreach or any kind of forethought in impacting people with disabilities specifically. I travel and speak in churches all the time. I've never been to a church that doesn't have a kids ministry or youth ministry. Most of them have some kind of ministry for seniors. Apparently you have a women's ministry because they have a taco get-together, which we don't get to go to as men. But typically, most churches don't have something specific to people with disabilities. Now, why is that? Because it's an unknown, it's overlooked, it's not people that are often seen. Back in the day when you went to Walmart, you would be greeted by somebody that was typically in a wheelchair, had some kind of disability. That was a job that people with disabilities could get. For a lot of people, that's the only interaction with somebody with a disability that they knowingly have. And so we try to get out in churches and just to raise awareness to the need of a church to reach out to people with disabilities, and I'm just going to talk a little more about that. But I'm going to pray first, if that's okay. So could you bow your heads, please? Father God, would you just be with me as I speak and put your words in my mouth? And I thank you for this church family, and what has brought them to today. And God, I ask that you would give a message that would just capture a few people who would want to join us in a week-long missions trip to serve you in this way and reach out to people with disabilities. And again, we thank you for this opportunity. In Jesus' name, amen. So we were talking before the service in the back, Becky and I, and there's kind of an odd coming to this church for me. My grandparents went to this church for many, many decades. So I kind of grew up coming in and out of this church a lot, going to Sunday school here, and I'm not from Green Bay. I lived here for a short time as a child. I grew up in Chicago, but whenever I was in town with my grandparents, we were here. And then Becky and Tim and the family coming here has made a further connection. I have spoken here multiple times in the last 28 years of doing the ministry that we do, going back to the other sanctuary on the other side, where when I walk through the back doors, I was telling her this morning, there's something nostalgic for me to walk through those doors. The same smell, the same feelings kind of come back. So we are thankful for you as a church family. So many of you have been involved at Camp Daniel in some way, coming as counselors and helping us in so many different ways to do the ministry that we do. So we are thankful for this church, and I'm thankful for Pastor Matt, because I know he's going to watch this to make sure I didn't say anything really stupid. And just to see how many people were here when he's gone. I speak in a lot of churches, and they're usually kind of mostly empty, because when the pastor's gone, the people tend not to come. So then I often wonder, did the pastor look and see who's there and who's not there? I don't know. Maybe most people don't think that. But so I'm just going to start my time by sharing a story with you. It's a story about a young man named Tom, and Tom grew up here in Green Bay, and his story is a hard one, but ends in a good way. And I got a call one morning from a social worker that I had gotten to know that had a couple different campers who had come to her. She had got them to come to camp, and she had this. This is 20-some years ago. She had a young man named Tom that she had met with, and Tom had grown up in Green Bay, but was now in Marinette County, so he lived over on Day Street. He lived with his single mom. Actually, he had a father, but his father was in prison from the time Tom was just about 1 year old and hadn't been with the family. And so single mom raising him, and then he had three brothers. He had three older brothers. He was the youngest. The next oldest brother to him had Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and if you know what that is, it's basically a death sentence in some ways, that typically boys who get Duchenne's muscular dystrophy tend to pass away in their early 20s just from the complications of the disease. And so Tom also had two older brothers who did not have the disease, but did a lot of caregiving for the brother and also for Tom, because Tom also had Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and he was, I think, about 6 years younger than his older brother. So what happens with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is you slowly lose muscle mass, and if you're ever able to walk, eventually you're not able to walk, and you'll use a wheelchair, and you tend to have breathing problems, and there's a host of different things that go along with muscle loss, enlarged hearts, those kind of things. So Tom watched as his older brother was growing up, and when Tom was 9 years old, muscular dystrophy took his brother's life. And so Tom saw what happened to his brother, who was quite a few years ahead of him, and saw what his life was going to experience in that process of living, that his muscles were going to get weakened, and he would struggle, and he eventually would die. And there was some discussion in the family about that. So within the process of Dad going to prison and Tom and his brother having muscular dystrophy, it was overwhelming for his mom, and she struggled to keep the family together and do what she needed to do. They lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment over on Day Street, and Mom had 1 bedroom. The three older brothers had a bedroom, and then Tom would sleep on the couch. And after Tom's older brother had passed, his 2 oldest brothers became his main caregiver, each of them. They would get him up in the morning to go to school and help him get ready for the day. And what he would typically do is after they got him up, they'd get him in his wheelchair, get him dressed, get him helped, and then he would go out into the other bedroom, knock on the door, and he would try to wake up his mother. But often it was a very hard thing to do, because his mom had become a heroin addict through the years. Especially after his brother died, she fell into a pit of despair, which you can imagine, and knowing what was going to be coming for Tom. And so this became a typical occurrence for him, where he struggled to wake her up, and he was slowly but surely become a very angry young boy. And one morning his brothers had got him up, and he went into bedroom to wake up his mom, and he couldn't wake her up, and he went close to the bed, and she looked kind of white to him, is what he explained, and he went and got his brothers, and they went in the room, and she had passed away in her sleep of an overdose. And this kind of crushed Tom's life and the rest of the family's life. So he was immediately thrown into foster care. He went into the foster care system here in Green Bay, and at that point, he was, I think, 12 at that time, and he became one of the most incredibly angry kids at that age that I've ever met in my life. He was angry at the world. He was angry at God, if he even believed there was such a thing. angry that he was going to die. He was angry at everybody and everything. And because he couldn't use his muscles well, the only muscle that worked was his mouth. So he would spew at you vile things at all times when you met him. And so when he got into these different foster care homes, eventually he would work his way out of those because he'd be kicked out because he would verbally abuse those families so badly. He ended up moving up to Oconto County and did that in 2 homes there. He was asked to leave in those homes. And then he was put on the caseload of my friend Tammy, who was a younger social worker up there. And she had a few campers who had come to our camp and knew that their lives had been changed through the process. I don't think she knew why. Don't think she fully understood it, but she was kind of desperate to find some help for Tom. So she called me and said, "Do you think you could fit Tom into camp? He's full care, he's in a wheelchair, he's going to need everything." And then she paused and she said, "And I just need to explain to you, he's angry. He's a bit angry, and he's got some issues." And we've experienced a lot of people with issues over the years at camp, but it's never something we haven't been able to deal with. So I agreed to let this kid come, and he showed up at camp, and big van pulls up, and this young girl that was probably 5 foot tall, little thin girl, comes out of the van. I thought, man, how is she going to handle him? And I could see him through the window, and he was eyeing me up. And my name tag says Little Tony, because that's what they call me at Camp Daniel Director on it. And he rolled out onto the lift to get out of the van, and he spied my name tag immediately. And he said, "You're the director." And I said, "Yeah, I am," thinking we're going to have a conversation. And he started to spew words at me that I hadn't heard in a long time about what a horrible person I was to force him to come to this camp. He didn't want to go to camp. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to do this. And they were forcing him to come, and he was angry, and he was going to call the cops. And this went on and on for 5 minutes as she quietly and calmly just brought him down in the lift, got him down on the ground. He just kept at me. And I pulled her off to the side, and I said, could you take him back? Do you think it's possible? Because I don't think this is going to work out for him or for us. He's too angry. And his mouth is so bad. I mean, I don't know how we're going to fit him in to a situation at camp with all these other campers. And she said, I've been hired as a driver. I can't, I'm sorry, but nothing I can do. And she pulled out a piece of paper with the social worker Tammy's name and number on it. She says, "You can call Tammy and ask her." Well, I couldn't do that. So it was a miserable experience for the first 3 days of camp. He made everybody miserable in his cabin. He made everybody miserable. Didn't matter what they were doing, he made them miserable. And he was the most angry kid at that age that I had ever met in my life. But there's little he could do about it except just use his mouth to talk about it. So he abused his counselor. He abused everybody around him in every way. There was nothing we could do or say. The third night of camp, we had a speaker who also had muscular dystrophy. His name was Jim. And Jim was up on the stage, and he had an altar call at the end of his service that night. And easily and simply explained the gospel message to all of our campers that were there and our counselors too. And the first person that came forward, Tom was sitting towards the back, and he zoomed his electric wheelchair right up to the altar. And a bunch of us gathered around with him, started to pray for him and with him, and he prayed the sinner's prayer. And I've never seen anything like it myself, but it was almost like something melted out of him. His insides kind of came out, and all that anger melted away. And he was a measurably changed human being within minutes after that. And through the rest of the week, it was a beautiful week. He became close to his counselor and kept in contact with him for a long time, and worked his way out of the foster system in Marinette, ended up back here in Green Bay, and we all got to spend a lot of time with him over the next, he was 14 then, and so then the next 7 years, we got to spend a lot of time with him. And the story, I don't know if it ends, but the story with me kind of ends with him is that he passed away. We had his funeral up in Marinette, and I got a chance to speak at his funeral. And his mother had got herself cleaned up at that point, and his two brothers were at the funeral, and I had a chance to speak and talk directly to them and the few people who were there. A lot of camp counselors were there and such, and just express that Tom had Jesus come into his life and what that meant to him, how that changed his life and changed who he was, changed his outlook, and changed his understanding of how that God had made him and that God loved him so much and that God had a plan for his life. And Tom affected many people in that short time. And his social worker was at that funeral, and that opened the door to be able to share with her about the reason why campers came to Camp Daniel and why it affected and changed so many of them, because Jesus was present there, and you can't be in the presence of Jesus and not be affected. It'll either push you away or it'll push you forward into him. And she was kind of awed by that, and since then she's become a Christian herself, not at Camp Daniel, but I think it was part of the process that opened that door. So it proved to me again that God always has a plan, and God is always thinking ahead. And it's not a typical story. How do you know I need that? Thank you. It's a typical story to Camp Daniel in that most of our campers that come to Camp Daniel do not know Jesus as their Savior, have never had that opportunity to have that experience because typically they don't go to church. So most of our new campers come and they're unsaved, and this is the opportunity for them to experience this. It's a lesson when Tom came and was saved as he was so incredibly and so amazingly. It's been an example for me over and over and over in 28 years of ministry, not to doubt, not to send somebody away because I don't think we can handle them, or they're going to be such a terrible person that we're not going to like them and they're going to be disruptive. Again, that God always has a plan, and that if we step into something, even if it's hard and even if it's scary, God's going to meet us on the other side and something good's going to happen. And that's been the experience over and over that we've seen hundreds and hundreds of people over the years saved through the weeks of camps that we have. And that kind of sums up who we are and what we do as a ministry. Our goal is simply to bring people to the feet of Jesus and allow them to be touched by Jesus. And through a loving relationship with a God-loving counselor that they spend a week with, just as a friend, they're typically touched through that, and they have that opportunity to meet Jesus and then pray that prayer that's so important to us all. And it's really that simple for us. So we kind of have developed a three-part theology, kind of probably starting with Tom and continues with us. And we have three things that we say, three lines that you hear over and over and over in every teaching that we do at Camp Daniel. And it's God loves me, God made me, and God has a plan for my life. And if we can impart that to our campers, we often feel that this gives them a leg up down the road into meeting Jesus and becoming a Christian. So we have a lot of different ways we reach out in the disability community. Camp is the foremost and main way we do that. We have a group home on the property, so we have guys who live with my wife and I failed to introduce our staff. My wife, Carol, is down here. Wave to everybody. And my son, Evan, and my other daughter, Ruth, and my daughter, Anissa, is hiding back in the booth, I think. They're all here, and they'll all be at the table, and you can meet them after. We have 10 full-time missionaries that do the work at Camp Daniel and make sure that we are doing the ministries that God calls us to do. So, like I said, we have a group home. We have getaway retreats that are weekend-long retreats. We have special day programs. Yesterday we had something called Dance for Disability over at Bay Beach, and there was 400-plus people with and without disabilities there to share a meal and do a dance, and Hannah was there. It was fun, wasn't it? And it's something we've been doing for the last 12 years, and she was boogieing down like everybody else. It was amazing. So we do day events like that down here in Green Bay and then up in the Crivets area where our camp is. We do Special Olympics. We have a team here in Green Bay, the Able Attack, and we also have teams up in the Crivets area that our staff coaches and mans. And these are all different ways for us to reach out in the disability culture that exists and to share Jesus with them. We have churches that we oversee. We have our Able Church here in Green Bay, which meets over here on the west side of town. We have the Mixed Community, which also meets here over on the west side of town. And then we have a church in Sheboygan, a church type setting in Milwaukee, and another one down in Chicago area that we have counselors that oversee and pastor those situations. And so the reason we're here, the bottom line of why I'm here as a missionary, is we need people to help us. We can reach as many people as volunteers as we can get. So if you come to our camp, you're matched up with a camper. If you're here for the first time, typically it's one camper. You never have more than 2 campers as a counselor, and you get to be with them for a week. Typically, they're men and women who are high functioning. They're ages 8 to age 80. You see pictures throughout the slides of different campers and counselors we have. So we need counselors of every age. We need young counselors that are in their teens. Our oldest counselor, how much? 90. Our oldest counselor this year is 90, Ron. And Ron travels around the world painting. Is that him on there? Oh, yeah. That's Ron last year. He was 89. And so there's something for everybody to do. And the whole idea is that we're sharing the love of Jesus just by hanging out with somebody for a week. Most of our campers simply need a friend, need somebody to be with them to go through the process of what we do at camp. And we do all typical camp stuff, but we probably do it in a non-typical way. Everything's adjusted so everybody can be involved and everybody can do the fun camp stuff that we do. So we have fire pits and we sing songs and we go swimming, we go fishing. We have a group of men in town that are fixing up a pontoon boat so we can do pontoon rides this year. And then we have a rec field and we play games and we do just a variety of different typical camp stuff that people do at camp. So the number one thing that I get asked when we come to churches and speak and do a service, people want to know why there are so few people, what is a disability and why there's so few people with disabilities that know Jesus or go to church. People want to know why that is. And so I always like to address that and kind of talk about disability in that vein. I think a lot of what disability means to us, and if I polled you, you probably would have a lot of different things that you would define disability by. So our perception of people with disabilities, I don't know, sometimes when I ask this of a crowd, it can be very skewed about what people think. But typically it's a group of people who do not know they're loved and do not value themselves. Does that make sense to everybody? I grew up in a loving Christian family that goes back generations. I've never spent a moment in life where I haven't felt loved, that I haven't been prayed for or cared for in that way. That's a big deal. That's a blessing beyond what I can express in any way. But our campers don't experience that in general. So it becomes a hard thing where we have to impart value to people who feel valueless. So I had started a few years ago looking at what it meant to have a disability and how we define that as Americans, basically. And I looked it up in the Webster Dictionary. So the definition is a condition that causes disqualification, restriction, disadvantage, or a limitation. Words from the thesaurus after that, the synonyms are crippled, helpless, useless, wrecked, stalled, hobbled, paralyzed, battered, bruised, mangled, mauled. Maimed, mutilated, roughed up, wounded, disfigured, scarred, broken, damaged, harmed, hurt, impaired, injured, bashed, beaten, belted, bludgeoned, buffeted, hammered, pummeled, pounded, thrashed, whacked, flogged, lashed, handicapped, weakened, and decrepit. See also hurt, useless, and weak. I've shared that 50 times in churches. Have I ever not cried when I've shared it? I cry every time because it's disheartening to me that that's a people group is described like that. That's words right out of a dictionary. That scares me. The antonyms of that are healthy, cured, healed, rehabilitated, fixed, mended, rejuvenated, renewed, repaired, restored, healthy, hearty, robust, sound, strong, well, whole, wholesome, capable. It's incredibly negative, right? That's the perception that as Americans we generally live with when it comes to people with disability. It's a group of people that we are called to find pity for. And pity is among the most disgusting words in the language to me. I hate the word. I hate the idea of pitying somebody. We don't need to pity each other. My wife had a stroke a little over 2 years ago. She's lost the ability to use one arm, and she has a special brace to help lift her leg up. She's lost the ability to say a lot of things, a lot of words, and can't say sentences well. I don't want her to be pitied. I want to have compassion. I want to care. I want to love. But pity's not going to do her any good and is not going to help her. But she's experienced a lot of that. So firsthand, we know what that's like. Camp Daniel is named after my brother who had muscular dystrophy also. He was an Assembly of God pastor for many years. He helped write many of the position papers within the Assemblies of God. When he was just an older teenager, he was invited down by G. Raymond Carlson to Springfield to help write those. He was on a board of 4 other men who were, most of them, that's a picture of him, that were much older than him, and helped write these position papers on disability in the church and what it meant. So I grew up having a brother who was in a wheelchair, who needed care, who we had to help. He had an iron lung. That's one of his portable ones that he would take to camp when he went to it. That help him breathe. Basic things like that he needed help with. And he traveled around speaking at churches and kind of all over the United States. He played the keyboards. His hands were atrophied, so he'd play the keyboard with his thumbs. But he had an incredibly powerful message. And he was always battling against the concept of how he was defined by the world, that he was useless, that he needed to be fixed and healed and rehabilitated. And that was a terrible thing for him to have to contend with his whole life. And my mom would repeat to him positive words, how God described him, how God saw him, and how God valued him. And that's one of our goals at Camp Daniels, to bring in counselors to interact with people with disabilities, to find out that they're people just like you and I. Disability or not, it doesn't matter. So words are a big deal because words describe our thoughts. Words describe our feelings. Words lead to deeds for each of us. Words guide our actions. We use words to define things. And so disability has been defined. It's been defined as negative, defined as suffering, defined as something that's less than, something that's unwanted, something that needs to be fixed, something that's valueless. How do you tell somebody that God loves you and God made you and God has a plan for your life when you feel totally valueless? It's a tough thing. So the concept that we have of people with disabilities is from a humanistic economy. Does that make sense to everybody? It's not from God's perspective. It's from a human perspective. And human perspective and the human economy will fail us every time. But I go to churches all the time. I see the humanistic way of thinking brought out in a lot of things that happen in churches. And this is scary to me. God's economy is so different. God's value system is so different. And we can't let humanism seep into our ministries and to our theologies that we have within a church setting. I could preach many sermons over and over about God's economy versus the humanistic economy. When we begin to interact with people who kind of live outside our norms and our typicals, it can be hard. We tend to go back to the things we know, and what we know is usually the things that have been put on us by media, by the way we do ministry, the way we do a lot of things in the United States. But in God's economy, we need everybody. God has a plan. His plan calls for everybody. The church is called to be full, a full body with everybody there. So if there are not people with disabilities in proportionate to what they exist in the world, the church is limping along with not everybody there, with gifts that don't exist unless those people are there. So in the bottom line for all of it is that we are dependent people. We need weakness. I believe that God has wrote it into our DNA. It says in Genesis 1:26 that God has made man is in his image. In Genesis 2:18, God says to Adam that you should not be alone, you need help. And so he made Eve. So from the very beginning, from the first concept of human beings, God's implanted the idea that we need each other, that we can't live without each other, that Adam couldn't live by himself. He needed Eve to be there to help him. Did that make Adam disabled? I think it does, if you go by definition. Did that make him all those things on that list that I read from Webster's dictionary? I don't think so, but the world would say that. So if God's plan was for dependence and neediness, why do we run for it so often? I'm the kind of guy, I'll try to do anything. I'm not afraid to try anything. I'm going to pull myself up by my own bootstraps, as my grandpa used to say, kind of guy. I don't want to ask for help. It's hard for me to ask for help. But we need to ask for help. It's important for us to ask for help. God loves us, and He made us to be dependent, and we fight against that dependence. But one of the wonderful things about people with typical, intellectual and developmental disabilities especially, there's an automatic need for help. My brother had a physical disability, was in a wheelchair, used an iron lung. He couldn't wash his own face or brush his own hair without help from somebody. So we had to fill that role as a family. His dependence was right in our face all the time, 24 hours a day. We could never escape it. That was one of the most beautiful things about him, one of the beautiful gifts that God gave him. It was hard for him. He struggled with that. We struggled to have to do that for him. But the lessons we learned from that and took from that as God-loving people were incredible. After my wife Carol had a stroke a few years ago, we've had to learn to live in a new way, and we're still in that process because it hasn't been that long. I've had to learn to be a caregiver in a different way like I used to with my brother. She's had to learn to accept help, to get in the shower, to get dressed, to whatever it is, any given thing. She uses a wheelchair at times or a cane. Life is slower. Life is different. Life is not what it was. It's not better or worse at this point. There was some time that I went through that this was worse, and that I grieved the time. But I think we're closer than we've ever been. We're more dependent on each other than we've ever been. God has done wonderful things within the process of learning to be more dependent on each other and the need for each other. One of the best stories in the Bible for me that I take solace and I think about a lot is the story of Moses, that he was a boy abandoned in a river, put in a basket, and picked up by the daughter of the king. And he was raised in the castle and then made some stupid decisions and did some dumb things and basically was kicked out. So in Exodus 4, God asked Moses, he wants him to do something for him, do this project for him, basically. And do you remember how Moses responded to that? He responded as a valueless person. He said, I can't. Basically, he said, I have a disability. I have a weakness in the eyes of the world. I'm broken. There's no way I can do what you're asking me to do. How many of us can understand what that feels like, to feel broken enough you can't do what God wants you to do? How often do you sit in church when Pastor Matt wants you guys to do something related to what's going on in a church, and you say, I can't, I'm broken. I'm not the person to fill this job. I feel like that all the time, personally. So God's reply to Moses is, that I think that he was laughing when he was answering him, but he said, I made you. I made you how you are. I made you with a disability. I made people who can talk and cannot talk. I made people who can hear and cannot hear. I made people who can see and cannot see. So to me right there was the mandate that God created and allowed disability to be something that's part of somebody important's life. There's few characters in the Bible that are more important than Moses, right? And I can't get around those verses. And so we base our ministry a lot on that. God doesn't allow our words to fall on deaf ears when we tell him we can't do something. So what does he do? What was the response? It was to send a counselor, somebody to help, right? A brother to come and help Moses be the leader that he needed to be, which didn't take away from Moses' ability, didn't take away from his leadership, didn't take away from anything that God wanted him to do. It actually increased his leadership and helped him become the leader that God wanted him to be. So God's always looking for ways to bring us together in dependence and help each other. And we saw that happen through Moses. God knew who he made, and he loved Moses, and he had a plan, and he found a way to make sure that was lived out. So what I'm trying to get down to is if we start looking at each other, seeing each other through God's eyes, through God's economy, through God's value system, it can change how we interact with others. It can change in what the need for others is. I know there's people in this congregation that don't feel valued, that don't feel like they're important. I'm going to pick on somebody. Hannah, I know there's days you don't feel valued, right? You don't feel important. You struggle through life. Does anybody walk up to Hannah and go to Hannah and say, I need you. I need something that God has in you to help me. We can't live without each other. We can't live with the weakest person in this room or the strongest person in this room, with the most well-seasoned Christian down to the newest Christian who may not even be a Christian, but God can still use. If we can get that in our heads and let that go down in our hearts, that can change everything we do in life. And we're far happier, far closer, far more valuable to God people if we can get that within our heart, if that makes sense. Is everybody tracking with me? You guys are non-responsive, so that's hard for me. I'm used to response. So I should have told you that at the start, but and maybe it's too heavy, I don't know. Psalm 139:14 says, we are all wonderfully made. 1 Corinthians 12:12 says that we are one body. Ephesians 4:16 says God makes the whole body fit together perfectly. Romans 12:4 and 5 says God made us one body. So I want to express it one more time. God has a plan. The plan is for dependence. Dependence makes us strong. It makes us able to fulfill his plan for our life. I'm not telling you that Camp Daniel is the end-all for that, but it's a great place for all of us to get together and start learning the concept of dependence from a group of people that can teach us to us very readily and very easily, and that kind of live and exist in that gift. Pastor Matt must be really good. There's no clocks in this church. It's weird. Usually there's a really big clock in the back. So you got to wave me down when I need to stop. I don't know what time I'm supposed to stop. Oh, 10 more minutes. Okay. Okay. Pastor Brain, I just heard a half hour, 45 minutes. So I won't do that. So I want to share one last story of something that's happened to me in my walk. I've been a Christian my whole life. Like I said, my parents got married in this church. I was dedicated in this church. My grandparents were Christian on both sides of my family. My great-grandparents were Christians, were involved in the church. I'm not saying that to brag to you. I'm telling you that part of my culture as a human being is to be in church and to be in front of God. That's something I'm used to. But I came through Sunday school that just like you have here. I went to a youth group very much like you guys have here. I experienced all of that. I got baptized in the church. I got involved in the church. We had Royal Rangers. I don't even know if that exists in the assemblies anymore. But I went through all of that. So everything I know was kind of defined by our experience at church. But I still didn't know how to interact with God in a right way. So Carol and I started dating in high school in art class. We ended up getting married after we graduated college, both with art degrees. She was in interior design. I was in advertising design. We were far from camping ministry material in any way. But my brother got sick when he was 21, and the doctors kind of proclaimed this sickness, he wasn't going to make it through, that his heart was enlarged, he was in the iron lung, that he was having such breathing difficulties, he only had a matter of months to live. And so we had probably a perfect death in a lot of ways. Not that death was easy, it was hard, but we got to share and experience that as an even larger family. Everybody came to see him and spend time with him. We had nurses that would come in his room in the last weeks of his life, and several nurses who didn't know Jesus were hired and would come in, and they would spend an overnight with him, and they'd come out in the morning, and they gotten saved overnight, miraculously. I don't have an explanation, other than that God's power worked in my brother's weakness. And he was never more powerful than he was laying flat on his back, stuck in an iron lung, with barely ability. You had to get right close to his face either to hear him talk. And yet God was using that time to see change in other people's lives. And I still, I think about that a lot. That was closing in on 30 years ago. And I think we're still in contact with some of those nurses who were saved during that time. I needed something like that in my life. Not that I wasn't saved, but I wasn't living a life for Christ, that's for sure. I was struggling, I was depressed, I was fat, I was slogging along, right, Carol? She can tell you. And when he got sick, he used to go up to a camp in Minnesota that had 1 week of camp, and he was a speaker there. He'd bring his keyboard and be very involved in that ministry up there, and he couldn't go, my parents couldn't go, Becky's sister Christy was going, a bunch of people in my family went, but the one thing I was not interested in was going to camp anywhere, ever, no matter what. I had no interest in all the rules of camp. You have to do this at this time. Camp was not anything I wanted to be involved with, and people with disabilities was the very last thing I wanted to be involved with. But purely out of pity in that moment, pity for my brother, the terrible word that I hate, I felt pity because he couldn't go to the camp, and he asked me to go. And he said, I have the sound system in Mom and Dad's garage, and I need you to bring it up there. That was his guys getting me up there. So I talked to Carol. I said, we need to take the sound system up. And then a few days later, he threw on me, well, why don't you be counselors while you're there? And because you're going to have to bring the sound system back. And I felt he tricked me. I still say that to this day. But so we did that. I talked to my sister and my brand new brother-in-law. They had been married for 3 weeks, and he couldn't say no because he was new to the family. So we all got in the van and went up to Minnesota and went to this camp. And doing caregiving and that kind of thing was not, I'd grown up doing that. For me, it wasn't a scary thing in any way, but it was life-changing in many ways to be there at that camp. My first camper, and I would never do this to a new camper, but my first camper was in a wheelchair. He couldn't speak. He had cerebral palsy, and when he wanted to say yes, he would tilt his head to the left, and he wanted to say no, he'd tilt his head to the other side, and that was his form of communication. It was a bit scary through the process in some ways, but it was a life-changing experience. We got home from that camp, and 2 weeks later, Dan passed away. When we went to a church of about 1,000 people down in Chicago, and when we had the funeral, it was a memorial service maybe 3 weeks later, and he wanted to have a celebration, and there was close to 1,000 people at the funeral service, which was incredible. So that next summer, we went back to camp, and that year, everybody got to go back. So my mom and dad went back, my cousin Christy was there, a number of my cousins showed up there, and we all went back, and I was assigned, I think, 4 campers. One of the campers I was assigned, his name was David. David had Down syndrome, and we were the exact same age, within months of each other. David's dad was a professor over at Winona State University, and lived at home with his mom and dad as an adult, and he had a couple of brothers and sisters who had kind of moved around the United States. But David, we connected on orange Cheetos and orange pop, or orange soda, as you call it here. So we'd go to the snack stand, we'd wait for that moment, and that was the biggest time of his life, was to go to the snack stand. And if you ever come to camp, you'll find out why that is. Campers love snack time. And I was one of those who loved snack time. So we connected on eating. And he was always in charge of me for the whole week, even though I was his counselor. So he would decide when we were going somewhere because he was stubborn. One night I couldn't find him. I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I went into the men's bathroom, and it was dark, and I stood by the door, and I could hear something. I could hear crunch, 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 and David was in the stall with a bag of Cheetos, 3 o'clock in the morning, eating Cheetos. And he was never more mad at me when I took his half bag of Cheetos away from him and sent him back to bed. But that was the way kind of things went. So David came from a really loving Christian family. He grew up going to church, and he loved the services we had. And at this camp, there was a very long, drawn-out worship service that always had an altar call. And all the campers would get up and would cry because a lot of the campers, especially Down syndrome, are very emotional. And I felt it to be excruciating because we'd sit there for sometimes an hour after the service was over. But it was a good experience for them. Well, David was always the last person to come out of the chapel. And I couldn't go downstairs to where the snacks were, and he couldn't go down until he was done doing his worship time. So everybody else had left the chapel. The guy that was playing the piano was the last one to leave. He left one light up on the altar, kind of like this, and they turned everything else off, thinking maybe David would want to leave. And I was sitting in the back at the soundboard, and I kept, every time David he was standing like this and kind of rocking, and every once in a while he'd turn around and look at me, and I knew he was just messing with me, but wasn't quite sure. And every time he'd turn around, I'd say, "Come on, Dave, let's go get Cheetos." And finally, I went down to the snack stand and got Cheetos and orange pop and shook the Cheetos, trying to get him to come out of the chapel. And he was stubborn and wasn't going to move. So after about 45 minutes of that, being up there alone, and I had another counselor went and put the rest of my other campers to bed, and David was standing kind of at the front with his hands crossed and just kind of rocking and moving, and all of a sudden he started doing this. He was up at the front, had his eyes closed, had one hand in the air, and he was going like this, and he did that for maybe 20 minutes, and he was mumbling something, and David had 2 hearing aids. He was hard to understand because he was partially deaf, And you have to get really close to him to understand. And at one point, he turned around and looked at me, and I'm waving him this way, and he goes like this for me to come up by him. All right, David, I went up to the front. So typically, you'll see me, only times you'll see me without a hat is when I'm speaking in a church, because you wouldn't like that. And if I go to your funeral or a wedding, I'll take off my hat. But I'm always wearing a hat. So I have my hat on. I walk up to the front and stood right next to him. And he stopped for a minute what he was mumbling and looked at me. And he reached up and grabbed my hat and threw it on the ground. And if you know me, that really makes me mad. I don't like people touching my hat. But what am I going to do? I'm at, the beck and call of David, and he's in control. And so then he started again. He started just mumbling something, hand in the air again. And this went on and on for about 5 minutes. And finally, I'm listening closer, and he looks over at me, and he takes the back of my head and pushes it down. And he says, "Pray." Like, that's the logical thing to do, right? We're at the altar. Why aren't you praying? He didn't say that, but that's what he meant. And so, okay, I put my head down and closed my eyes. I wasn't going to pray. I'm praying that we would get out of there and go eat Cheetos and orange pop, I'll be honest, and go to bed at that point. And so he kept up with this thing, and this went on another 10 minutes where he put his hand back up in the air and he started scooping like this. And he's mumbling. Pretty soon he's getting loud enough that I can kind of understand, so I'm listening. And pretty soon I can hear what he's saying. More Jesus, more Jesus, more Jesus, more Jesus. And it still affects me because I've told this story 1,000 times, and it still makes me cry. Something came over me in a way that I never experienced. And without him saying anything other than more Jesus, I just had this sense that I was in the wrong, that I was thinking wrong, my processes were wrong, everything I was doing was wrong. And after another 10 minutes, David put his arm around me, and he kind of whispered in my ear, "More of Jesus, less of you. More of Jesus, less of you." It's the best sermon I ever heard. It profoundly changed my life. I walked out of that chapel not being the same man in any way, understanding that God had called us to do camping ministry for people with disabilities. Of course, I went home and I was afraid to tell my wife for about 1.5 years. We were living here in Green Bay and became severely depressed. And I rolled over in bed one night, scared to tell her that God wanted us to start a camp and become missionaries. And this went on probably for 9 months. I became fairly depressed, and I woke up. I wasn't even sleeping. 3 o'clock in the morning, I rolled over and I woke her up apologizing, because I thought when I told her that news, she was going to immediately say, "Well, we're getting divorced, you're nuts." And I apologized to her. I said, "I'm sorry, I'm waking you." She said, "That's all right." I said, "I need to tell you something." I said, I've been kind of depressed lately. She said, "Oh, you have?" like I couldn't tell. And I said, "I feel like God wants us to start a camp for people with disabilities." And she rolled over and she said, "Yeah, me too." And I got really mad. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Yeah, I have the same feeling." And I said, "Well, when did you start feeling this?" She said, "When we were at camp last year, the last night of camp at that chapel service." She never said anything. So here we are arguing in the bed at 3 o'clock in the morning over why we hadn't said something to each other. She was just scared by it. I shouldn't have been so scared about it. I grew up in church. I understood it. It made sense to me. It made no sense to her. And so that's when we started on this experience to start Camp Daniel and do what we're doing. My parents got involved. My dad's been our executive director, takes care of all the finances. My mom's been our nurse, and we've done all the programming and going out in churches and speaking and finding counselors and raising money and whatever else goes along with doing ministry. But a lot of that came right back to David. I wouldn't have been there if David, who had Down syndrome, who the world didn't value, who he didn't make sense to most people, that people wouldn't even take time to try to communicate with him because he mumbled when he talked, because he had hearing aids in his ear, he was valueless. So I see a lot of people walking around the world who are valueless, who have experienced that. I grew up in Chicago. Half of our church was people who were from Puerto Rican descent, who couldn't speak good English, and they didn't value themselves in a lot of ways. So I knew what that looked like. People with different races that experienced the same thing. People with different abilities or different inabilities, same thing. I remember growing up in church, and we would have the Fine Arts Festival. Do they still do the Fine Arts Festival? I don't know. So you could sing, and you would get ribbons, and then you'd go on to the state, and you go to the National Assemblies of God thing. And my My sister was a good singer, and she was on the worship team, and like Becky's daughter, she just was really good. So she got a lot of accolades at church. I was an artist, and I painted things. So I painted a beautiful picture. I won first place in our region. I won first place in the state. And then I went on to the nationals. And when I came in for the big ceremony where the church was going to celebrate me, they put my painting in the church library. And that spoke to me, oh, you don't have any value. Your gift isn't going to be used around here. So I understand what it's like to be valueless in a lot of ways. But without people who feel valueless, without people who are dependent and can share that with us, we don't get far. And it's hard to follow God and do the things that He asks us to do. So we need people with disabilities in our lives. How are you going to experience that? There's a number of people I know who go there. Pete's been here many times, right? Is he still going here? Yeah, he's still going. Okay, you guys know Pete, right? Don't get too close. He might bite you. He's a great guy. There's a number of people who have disabilities who go to church here, and that's a great thing, because I go to a lot of churches. There's nobody that I knowingly know of that has any kind of disability. Get around those people, experience those people, find out what those people do, understand what their dependence in life is like. Like Pete, he lives in a group home. He doesn't get to decide where he eats, what he does. Every decision is made for him. Those are hard things. Those would make you angry. Those would make you want to grab and seize for control. But he needs friends. And you need a friend, right? So don't overlook anybody. Don't overlook my friend Hannah. Right, Hannah? She's here. You need her. I'm sorry to tell you, but you need her. We can't live without each other. We can't be a full body if we don't have each other. So I've come here this morning. This is my last pitch. I need 4 counselors to come to camp this summer from this congregation. I don't know why 4, but I have that in my head. I need 4 counselors to come to this camp. If God has touched your heart in any way, I'm asking you to come talk to us. It's scary. It's fearful. Talk to Becky. Talk to Tim. Talk to the kids if you don't trust them because they're adults. They'll tell you the unbiased truth, right? I'm telling you, you will have a good time. You'll experience you probably will not experience in life in any other way, and you're going to help Camp Daniel fulfill its mission. And somebody will probably get their life changed. Maybe it'll be you. So, Becky, I invite you to come back up. I thank you guys for the time.